in the 12 years since 9/11, we have grown used to the accretion of power by the president so much that Congress has given up the authority and the courts are unwilling to assert that the president has gone too far.
Afghanistan is fast becoming the longest U.S. war ever, soon surpassing the U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
One count, President Obama has already used unmanned CIA drones even more than his predecessor.
According to the Washington Post, the NSA exceeded its legal authority thousands of times since 2008 with unauthorized surveillance of Americans.
The FBI actually invoked the term domestic terrorism when referring to nonviolent protesters in the Occupy movement.
Following the Declaration of Independence, the first Congress adjourned, and with ratification by the states, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution became part of the supreme law of the land. These 10 amending articles are, by popular accord, declared the nation's Bill of Rights.
Madison and Hamilton and Jay, who defended the Constitution, recognized that that was not complete. And in getting the Constitution ratified in 1789, it was important to add to it a specific guarantee of rights against what the federal government might otherwise encroach upon the states to do.
The Bill of Rights is put in place to prevent the people in power from treading on the basic rights of the people who are not in power.
The point of them is to protect spheres of liberty, spheres of privacy, areas in which the way we act will not be infringed by government. And to do that, they've got to be laws, not just suggestions.
It had to be put in such stark terms or it would not have served the purpose. The Constitution might not have been approved because of fears of the encroachment of the federal government. So a prohibition of encroachment that had weasel words in it, or that had a balancing test here and a preponderance of interests there, would not have satisfied the concerns of those who were hesitant about the Constitution.
We have something like 200 national governments in the world. And every national government pushes against the limitations on its power. Some don't have any real written limitations, some do. But governments always push for more money and more power. So the battle isn't necessarily global as opposed to national within each country, but there are always governments trying to limit free speech, trying to limit freedom of religion, trying to limit your freedom to make a living, trying to infringe on your privacy, trying to prevent opposition to the government.
This is our fundamental law. From those truths springs the American concept of liberty. Hasty judgment or pandering to politics must not change it.
Presidents have abused the Constitution from time to time. President Adams supported the Alien and Sedition Act, which allowed the president and the executive authority more generally to put people in prison for criticizing the government. It was a very surprising thing for President Adams, who was, of course, one of our principal founders. President Lincoln at least addressed it with his comment that shall all laws be followed but one, and the Constitution then be lost because we are so scrupulous in providing rights to these folks, these individuals who were criticizing the Civil War. It would undermine the war effort. We would lose the Civil War, the South would secede, and the benefits of the Constitution as a uniting document would be lost. President Woodrow Wilson, during the First World War, shut down many newspapers who were not as supportive of the war effort as he thought they should be. The civil liberties issues of our day are interception of metadata from our cell phones and internet communications, and the use of drones and other acts of war without the constitutional requirement of congressional approval.
Originally, wars tended to be declared. You know, you could say, all right, the state of war is over. And other wars since then, like Korea and Vietnam, weren't declared, but you had a pretty good idea of when the war had come to an end. War on terror, something as broad and expansive as that, you can always say there's still a threat out there, and so you can always keep these so-called temporary encroachments in place.
With no constraint or oversight. No constraint by Congress, because once having given the authority after 9/11, there was no deadline.
As we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens, I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
We know when a great crisis happens, it's when powers that be can run into the fear and create big change very quickly. You get to look at a terrorist attack and turn it into a war on a couple of countries. The plan of Al-Qaeda, very early, before 9/11, was to have us overreact in such a way that it would undermine the financial stability of the country. And the fact that we didn't, though, go after Saudi Arabia, the fact that Prince Baghdad is such a great friend of the Bushes, that instead we get to send home Osama's family members, we don't hold accountable any of the terrorists that came from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia since has been able to fund these madrasas, these schools in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Northern Africa to continue to fuel this radical Islamic mentality in a whole generation of young men. And so instead of looking at what the real problems were and where they were coming from and how they had affected the US, we went off on these adventures of the Bush gang that were about something totally different. They're about, from Saudi Arabia's point of view, they're about Saudi Arabia keeping control of the Middle East.
The Iraqi regime trained and harbored terrorists, including operatives of Al-Qaeda.
Osama and Iraq they're totally different ideologies. They hated each other.
The Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. This regime has already used weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological and chemical warfare and will keep trying to develop nuclear weapons.
I was in Iraq when Powell gave his speech to the UN, and the next morning I woke up and Bush had said, "The game is over, shock and awe."
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The Senate Intelligence Committee report a few weeks ago said there was no link, no relationship between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda.
I never said there was an operational relationship. The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
First thing I will do when I'm president is call in my attorney general and have he or she review every executive order to determine which of those have undermined civil liberties, which are unconstitutional, and I will reverse them with a stroke of a pen. You know, I taught constitutional law for 10 years. I take the Constitution very seriously. The biggest problems that we're facing right now have to do with George Bush trying to bring more and more power into the executive branch and not go through Congress at all. And that's what I intend to reverse when I'm President of the United States of America. If there is anyone out there who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer. The answer told by lines that stretched around schools and churches, because they believed that this time must be different. At this defining moment, change has come to America.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God?
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
What's sad is that we saw Bush doing that, but the Obama administration not only has continued it, but escalated it.
It is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
Violence isn't only on the rise in Afghanistan. Drone strikes have been reported in Pakistan and Yemen, but now there's news that a week ago, a U.S. drone aircraft fired on 2 leaders of the Somalian organization Al-Shabaab.
So drones have been around for about 10 years. What they are is an unmanned vehicle operated from far away, motorized and manipulated from near Las Vegas, Nevada, or northern New York State. Under the Obama administration, it escalated the use of drones. The argument for drones is that you're not killing American soldiers.
It's not a war in the sense that we necessarily have a lot of troops committed, but it is a war in the sense that there are just constant violent actions, often with the cooperation of the government in question, against people in those countries, and often hitting the wrong people. They're saying you're hitting militants, but there's a quote-unquote collateral damage, the people who are just standing by the wrong tree, and of course that turns more people against the United States.
America's actions are legal. We were attacked on 9/11. Within a week, Congress overwhelmingly authorized the use of force.
When do we authorize the use of drones? Was that authorized by Congress in the post-9/11 authorization to go after those parties, individuals, countries, or organizations responsible for the 9/11 attacks, or in order to prevent a recurrence of the 9/11 attacks? And the president's argument might be defensible, that it had to do with Al-Qaeda. This is the same Al-Qaeda that attacked the United States in 9/11.
You can definitely understand how at the beginning, when the government said, we are going to specifically target combatants who were part of Al-Qaeda, and they were in Afghanistan, but now they're in the border region, and now they're in Pakistan. You could understand why people might not view that as some sort of fundamental shift. Even though legally, it is a huge shift once you go from a place where there's a battlefield to a place where there's not a battlefield. But then they call it Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula without saying what the connection is between the people in the Arabian Peninsula and the people who caused the 9/11 attacks. And of course, the Arabian Peninsula is very far from Afghanistan.
So I'm just back from Yemen, and you can really see it there. The president of Yemen decides he needs American support, so he takes his army out of the poorest place in the country. So that way it becomes a vacuum that this guy who's Al-Qaeda can come in. And so what does he do? He just buys up all the kids that don't have jobs and promises them support and to nurture the community and great speeches. They're all seen as the Al-Qaeda for the Arab Peninsula. That president comes to the United States and says, oh, we have Al-Qaeda in our country, so we need a ton of money. So we give them, $1 billion or whatever we give them, and that, which is the same as almost their budget for the year. He gets the money, and then we get to become the mercenaries for him with our drones.
And then they do the same thing in Somalia. I understand that there's a militant movement that is Islamist that controls large parts of Somalia, I gather, Al-Shabaab. But what their kind of connection is to these other things and what that has to do with what Congress authorized, which was to use force against the people who were involved in the 9/11 attacks. Now we're so far afield.
And I think it would be very appropriate for Congress to repeal that and then give a much more tailored, appropriate authority, if they chose, for the use of force that the president might need. Or else it is subject to the interpretation of any place you want, any time you want, for as long as you want. You cannot have a one-time gift of the congressional authority to the president and all subsequent presidents. That's an unlawful delegation of authority. Any more than the president could say, I'm tired appointing federal judges, the Congress gets to appoint federal judges. No. The powers have to stay in the branches to which they're given.
There's no declaration of war. There's no, we're here and you need to change your behavior or else. Because the CIA is using them and denying they're using them, they don't fall even under the rules of war.
And before any strike is taken, there must be near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured.
Now, in World War I, it was 1% civilian to 99% target to those that have signed up to be at war. The effect of drones is that you're killing 99% civilians to 1% target.
It's very difficult to get perfectly clean numbers on it, but it's something like 3,000 people that have been killed. There's no question that the vast majority of those people were not combatants under any definition of that term.
One story out of Pakistan is when we went to meet the families of the drone victims, one of the guys, he talks about how he comes home and his son, who's 18, just graduated from school, was going to be the teacher of the village, and his brother have just been blown up in his house. And he talks about finding them, the little pieces on the wall, enough so that he could bury them. And he takes a long time to tell the horror story of coming home to this and what it looked like. And he pounds on the table, I just want to kill an American soldier, I just want to kill it, and he escalates his voice. We don't understand that, nor understand what the blowback is from that.
America does not take strikes to punish individuals. We act against terrorists who pose a continuing and imminent threat to the American people.
The war on terror, it doesn't have an enemy, or it doesn't have a conventional enemy, I should say. Obviously, there are people who attack the United States, but it's not as though someone can surrender and you say, now the war is over, now we can dial this back.
The imminent threat is so far from imminent that we've stretched the rules to be able to become terrorists ourselves.
The great difficulty is that we can use the war on terror as a phrase to justify
surveillance and spying.
The writ of habeas corpus, the question of an American citizen who was a target of a drone.
From the immediate aftermath of 9/11, you had the Patriot Act passing and huge new powers being given to the law enforcement.
Today we take an essential step in defeating terrorism.
Statements made by John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General the first Attorney General under George W. Bush. They say that the FBI and the Department of Justice are trying to transform themselves from punishing crime after it has occurred to a preventive model.
We've seen a huge shift towards a willingness to trade safety or national security for liberty. The revelations of last summer show that in great clarity. We've expanded dramatically the surveillance that our own government takes of us.
There is no spying on Americans. We don't have a domestic spying program.
The Guardian revealed the existence of a top-secret program codenamed Prism, where the NSA obtained access to the central servers of 9 major internet companies, including Google, Microsoft, Apple, Yahoo, and Facebook. The National Security Agency is collecting telephone records of millions of Verizon customers under a secret court order issued in April.
They all get together with the NSA and provide the NSA direct access to the back ends of all of the systems you use to communicate, and they're applying it to the whole of society by basically subverting a corporate partnership through major telecommunications providers, and they're getting everyone's calls, everyone's call records, and everyone's internet traffic as well. On top of that, you've got boundless informant.
And then The Guardian revealed details about an NSA data mining tool called Boundless Informant that details the voluminous amount of information it collects from computer and telephone networks.
The NSA is an agency that historically its mission has been to look outside of the United States for foreign threats. With the war on terror and increasing concern about radicalization of people in the United States and terrorists acting in the United States, one of the responses has been to turn our government surveillance apparatus on this country, and that includes American residents, American citizens. And that, combined with the increases in technology that makes surveillance possible, have created this incredible system for monitoring Americans' communications. That is something that I think would have been unthinkable 15 years ago.
Your duly elected representatives have been consistently informed on exactly what we're doing.
The NSA lied about the existence of this tool to Congress and to specific congressmen in response to previous inquiries about their surveillance activities.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
The fourth guarantees the people's right to be secure in their persons, preventing arbitrary searches and seizures.
The Fourth Amendment prohibits the federal government from engaging in unreasonable searches and seizures, and says that warrants shall not issue except upon probable cause. It doesn't say that the government can do these things, but the evidence can't be used in court. That's called an exclusionary rule. It outright says unreasonable searches and seizures are outlawed.
The people are protected against unreasonable search and seizure. Well, the question of what's unreasonable is not absolute. It's something we debate all the time. And the idea that the government is spying on us even when there's no allegation against us. It's one thing if you've got an allegation that this person is engaged in terrorism or is involved with terrorists, but just to be scanning all of our email and all of our phone calls just in case you might see patterns or something, that seems like an unreasonable search and seizure to me.
Historically, police have had to come up with a reason and go before a judge before they even got to collect any information, before they got to search somebody's house or their car or take their papers. Some kind of specific reason, right? Reasonable suspicion, probable cause. If they couldn't present a good reason to think that that person was involved in criminal activity, They didn't get to go into their house. The paradigm that's governing the NSA is the opposite. They seem to get to take everything. It's up to them to decide whether there's a reason to look at it. That's a very different world than what we're used to and what the Constitution seems to require.
They are not looking at content, but by sifting through this so-called metadata, they may identify folks who might engage in terrorism.
When we deal with intelligence operations, domestic intelligence, taking the information that is called metadata by the government, we are engaged in a seizure. I can't see any other way of interpreting it. The president is defending it by way of saying, well, we're not using it in court, we're not using it against you, and even though we've taken it, we won't actually search it until we have a more specific warrant, and then we will go to a court for a warrant. But note that that abstracts from the question of the seizure. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. Here we have a seizure, and the president's argument is, but it's not a search. Well, it's both are prohibited, not they have to be together in the same instance.
If the intelligence community then actually wants to listen to a phone call, they've got to go back to a federal judge, the FISA court.
Well, here Congress created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Foreign Intelligence Supervisory Court. So Congress said any issue involving the interception of and taking of evidence for intelligence goes to the FISA court.
There's a lot of concern these days among people who have discovered we have secret courts, the FISA court. The problem that it was created to deal with is sometimes there are things that you know about potential threats that you don't want to expose in open court. So they created this secret court to deal with these threats.
A court specially put together to evaluate classified programs to make sure that the executive branch or government generally is not abusing them and that it's being carried out consistent with the Constitution.
The problem is we're discovering how much broader it is than we thought, how secret it is. It's operating on secret interpretations of laws explained in secret memos that we're not allowed to see. Also, it's a very centralized court. It turns out one man, the Chief Justice, appoints all the members of this court. They're not necessarily a very diverse or balanced group. They hear only one side. Normally, a court, you hear both sides. These are people who are supposed to be protecting the Constitution, protecting the citizens' rights, but they only hear one side of each case, and it turns out they rule in favor of the government in something like 99.7% of the time.
Is that adequate? If the other side is never heard, if it's an ex parte decision.
I understand the motivation for setting up these courts where private discussions can be held, but like so many government institutions, it seems to have gotten way out of line.
So what finally comes down to being resolved is who can take the case to court, and what court do you take it to? And it appears the only court that has jurisdiction, according to Congress, is the FISA court, and the FISA court won't let you or I bring the case. There's no record that is made public. That would then implicate the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Things that we're learning about surveillance and spying and so on, I suppose that's a chilling effect on all of our activities. Lots of Americans these days joke, I don't like the government, but of course they already know that. Well, that's not really something to joke about. We do want a sphere of privacy.
Look, there's always been a balance between liberty and public safety, right? I mean, you could eliminate all crime in America by locking everybody up. But obviously that's a trade-off, and it's a trade-off that our Constitution sets very far toward the side of protecting liberty.
Why do you support the NSA's illegal and ubiquitous data collection?
This administration acts like violating civil liberties is the way to enhance our security. It is not. There are no shortcuts to protecting America. This administration also puts forward a false choice between the liberties we cherish and the security we provide. You can't have 100% security and also then have 100% privacy and zero inconvenience That means no more illegal wiretapping of American citizens. No more national security letters to spy on citizens who are not suspected of a crime. No more ignoring the law when it is inconvenient. In the abstract, you can complain about Big Brother and how this is a potential program run amok. But when you actually look at the details, then I think we've struck the right balance.
Well, today's news brings us a blockbuster story that shows just how powerful metadata really is. The NSA is using metadata as, quote, the primary method to locate targets for lethal drone strikes. In other words, metadata is being used right now by the United States government to target people for killing.
We kill people based on metadata.
Instead of wasting it on me when all I need is another chance. Think of the opportunities we'd be missing. There's so much that even just one man can do. I don't want to go back. I don't need to go back. I know it's a privilege, but I don't deserve to go back. Just give me one more chance. I give you my word of honor that I won't fail again. Believe me, I'm only thinking of...
Today we learned just how much authority the administration believes it has to kill without trial or evidence suspected terrorists, even American citizens.
The Obama administration killed a 16-year-old American citizen. We killed in a drone strike. Abdurrahman al-Awlaki was born in Denver. He was the son of an American citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki. The father had gone into hiding when it became clear that the U.S. government was trying to kill him.
He had been linked to the 9/11 attacks, and in more recent years had been linked to the Fort Hood shooting, to the potential bombing in Times Square, and to the failed underwear bombing back in 2009.
Imagine in World War II, an American decides to join the German cause, and that actually happened. There were some Americans of German birth or German ancestry who did. Then if we happen to kill them or fight them in battle, they die. It is perfectly legal. Their American citizenship will not save them. And al-Awlaki was trying to get further converts to the suicide mission, the bombing mission against the United States. And so Congress had given the authority to use force against such people, in which case it would be analogizable to a general giving an order to kill a German soldier during World War II.
The son, born in Denver, grew up a bunch in the U.S. He eventually went to Yemen, was living with the extended family, and then wanted to go find his father when his father was in hiding. The father got killed in a drone strike, and then 2 weeks later, the U.S. government killed the son. And the son was 16 years old. He had never preached sermons of violence against the United States or anything like that. First they said he was a military-age male, right? And the family countered that. Then they said that he was killed in the company of some other person who was a high-level al-Qaeda leader, and then the family countered that. But by then it was like 2 news cycles away. He wasn't. He was like at a picnic with his cousin and some other boys.
Never thought that one day this boy, this nice boy, will be killed by his own government for no wrong he did, certainly. Because how can, a 16-year boy will do anything wrong against anybody?
It's an American citizen that's being targeted without due process of law, without trial, and he's underage, he's a minor.
I would suggest that you should have a far more responsible father.
Every American should be really troubled by the notion that our government killed an American citizen without any trial and has just asserted that this is fine and that they can do that.
They help us prevent terrorist attacks.
Terrorism, 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 terrorism,
Terrorism.
terrorism, 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 evil terrorists, 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 Saddam Hussein, terrorists, 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 terrorists.
And you see terrorism used all over in the public rhetoric. It's ubiquitous in the public rhetoric, right? And what is a terrorist? There are a couple of definitions in the US Code, and they definitely do not accord with any common conception of what terrorism is. There's a definition in 8 U.S.C. 1182, which is the immigration code, but that definition is used in other places as well. That definition is so broad, it covers virtually any use of force of a weapon or other dangerous device between 2 or more people for a non-monetary purpose. It covers like all kinds of normal crime that nobody would ever think of to describe as terrorism. The Treasury Department and the State Department have lists of groups, and if you're put on that list, then you're a terrorist. If you're not on the list, then you're not a terrorist. And who decides if you're on the list? It's like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury and the Attorney General. It's obviously politicized. It's fine for the government to make a list of countries that we are friendly with and countries we're not friendly with, and groups that we like and groups that we don't like. But then you shouldn't pretend that that has some underlying normative content, right? That's just a political definition that's been used for political purposes. And yet, all the time in popular discourse and in legal discourse, people use the word terrorism. They talk about terrorists and terrorist groups and terrorist organizations. It's a remarkable modern example of like the emperor has no clothes. You know, there's no there. There's no actual precise content to this term, and yet everybody talks about it as they know what it is. One of the many serious problems with not having a precise conception of what we mean when we say terrorism is that it allows this slippage into criminalizing dissent, criminalizing people who just disagree with the government for whatever reason.
Law enforcement, even in America, has a long history of taking any surveillance program and applying it not just to people who are actually a criminal threat or an existential threat, but to people who are a political threat, right? And that could be journalists, opposition, politicians, dissidents. And you see that over and over again in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. was monitored by the FBI, ostensibly to investigate whether he had connections to the Communist Party.
We had a huge amount of government infiltration of various different kinds of perfectly lawful groups during the time of the Red Scare in the 50s and in the 60s.
A conflict which has become known over the last decade as the Cold War. The opposing point of view in this conflict rests on a fundamentally different vision of man, as a creature not of God, but of the state. In this system, the value of individual man diminishes sharply, and the state is all important. The state will run his life for him, his political life, his business life, his social life.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I shall
stand away from the stand.
Fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are trying to
take
destroy.
This man away from the stand.
You had that phenomena operating, and this abuse was kind of recognized, and it led to reforms that minimized those things. And yet now we see those kind of reforms and safeguards cast aside and a return to a lot of that same kind of surveillance conduct.
There's no reason to think that this time will somehow be limited so that it won't adversely affect political or ideological opposition.
Now, the evildoers in their mind are those people who are American citizens who are appalled at what's happening to their country and speak out. If you look at what's been thrown at Chelsea Manning and Snowden, by watching what we're doing and exposing it, both Chelsea in Iraq and Snowden inside what's happening with NSA.
The U.S. government has filed criminal charges against former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden.
Prosecuting leaks is absolutely something that limits the ability of the press to find out the truth and report it. Prosecuting reporters for getting leaks is a direct threat to the freedom of the press, and we're seeing that happen now.
You're calling for Snowden to be prosecuted, but to take it another step and say the journalists who published the information, that they should face prosecution, that is news. Do you believe that? You stand by that, both Greenwald and the Washington Post reporter?
To me, yes, there has to be legal action should be taken against them. This is a very unusual case with life and death implications for Americans.
James Cromwell, the New York Times reporter, whose 2006 book State of War details the CIA's attempt to foil Iran's nuclear program, is again being pressured by the Department of Justice to reveal his sourcing for the story. Cromwell has been subpoenaed in the criminal trial over the leaking of state secrets that appear in his book.
You saw this with WikiLeaks, where there were calls in Congress and statements about how, the WikiLeaks was a terrorist organization, or Julian Assange should be treated like a terrorist.
Julian Assange is engaged in warfare. Information terrorism, which leads to people getting killed, is terrorism. And Julian Assange is engaged in terrorism. He should be treated as an enemy combatant.
You see these very disturbing situations where the FBI infiltrates peace groups of all kinds, anti-war in Iraq and Afghanistan groups, Occupy.
And police infiltration in other parts of the country of conservative groups.
These unfortunately replicate a very troubling pattern that we've had in the history of this country.
There is all too often a perception by law enforcement that somebody who is politically organizing against the politicians in power, the government in power, the ideas in power, may also be engaged in some other kind of criminal activities against the government, when really there's very little foundation for that. And it's a very dangerous assumption to make, because investigating the opposition chills political speech.
There's nothing magical that makes the U.S. Be the way it is. You have enough of these kind of doctrinal changes and changes in the judicial system and the legal system, and the country could transform in a very troubling way.
Grassroots activism is a long tradition in the United States. It goes back to the committees of correspondence in the American Revolution, the abolitionist movement, the women's movement, the environmentalist movement, all those kinds of things had a lot of grassroots activism. In most cases, they also had intellectual leadership concentrated on the East Coast. So it's always a sort of coming together. But if you look at the Goldwater movement, that's very much a grassroots anti-establishment movement against the welfare state and also against the Republican Party establishment. Then you get the McGovern movement, very much created in Washington, but still drawing on the anti-war forces around the country.
Well, both the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement have a lot of diversity in them. I mean, there are people in the Tea Party movement who are really in revolt against the Republican Party, or at least started out that way. They were upset at what the Bush administration had become. They had upset at the K Street Project version of the Republican Congress. And there are people in the Tea Party movement who are Republican operatives, who are trying to shoehorn all these people into voting for candidates on the GOP line, and all sorts of spectrum in between them, between those two poles. Similarly, Occupy, I mean, it's more on the radical side of the left, I think, because it was sort of generated by the more anarchistic part of the left. But you've had groups like Move On, people like Van Jones coming in and trying to steer it into a Democratic Party direction. But there certainly are areas where the grassroots right and the grassroots left, the Tea Party types and the Occupy types, at least have the potential to cooperate.
First, you need constitutions that limit the power of government. Second, you probably also need Bill of Rights. Third, you need a free press. You need an independent judiciary, and you also need citizen vigilance, because none of this works if you don't have people concerned to protect their freedoms.
There are people on both the right and the left that are concerned about a government that usurps power against its citizens. From a political perspective, it's often people who are not in power who are the ones that are rightly most concerned.
You get opposition to the massive NSA spying on the left and on the right. Why? Because I think privacy and the notion of a government that sees everything that you do, that knows every communication, every phone communication, every email communication, that is deeply disturbing to people, regardless of whether they are Republican or Democrat and pro-government healthcare or anti-government healthcare or whatever it is. They really are about certain very basic principles that you don't actually have to have a particular political affiliation to understand and appreciate the importance of those principles.
There's a lot of distrust between people on the left and the right, and we just really do have this red-blue polarization. Every time you turn on cable television, there's a right-left argument going.
They're all in business to make profit.
And it's a good thing. That's the incentive that makes capitalism work.
Until you say something about government, too.
I mean, they want to be able to just program for a particular audience and bring in someone who's going to be the standard bearer for one side and a punching bag for the other side, and they're not so interested in breaking out of these sort of stale boxes.
If you turn on Fox, they're attacking Democrats. If you turn on MSNBC, they're attacking Republicans. People line up on the right or the left. They may not like everything Bush is doing, but they know the Democrats are worse. They may not like everything Obama's doing, but they know the Republicans are worse. So it makes it hard for them to trust each other. And then, of course, there are real philosophical differences. The people on the right don't like gun control, and the people on the left do. The people on the left like gay marriage, and the people on the right don't. And very fundamentally, a lot of people on the left like government providing transfer payments, and people on the right don't. So it's hard to get together in a political coalition. All of those people ought to have been united all along against Bush's push in the direction of wars around the world and abuse of executive power, and they ought to be united against Obama's wars around the world and abuses of executive power.
You find that there's a continuity from Democratic administration to Republican administration back to Democratic administration, and people on both sides of the aisle get behind these assaults on liberty. People speak to the fact that Republicans supported these encroachments as a way to excuse Democrats encroaching and vice versa. And I think to fight back, what you really need to do is find ways for people to defend freedom from both the left and the right. Try to take it out of these red team, blue team, poo-throwing matches, and really break out of those standard debates and into something where the people who care about liberty on both sides of the spectrum can battle the folks in the cozy establishment center from which so many bad ideas emanate.
One of the things that would require is the conservatives in the coalition not to be overly personal about Obama and tick off the progressives, and the progressives to be clear that they are willing to criticize, because it is President Obama who's talking about getting involved in Syria. You're going to have to mention him. You can't just keep blaming it on Bush. In general, the more people you have on any particular issue or coalition, the better off you are. If you can show broad-based support from left to right to libertarian, then that helps too. So it's a good thing to have people from both sides. They can influence more different members of Congress, that sort of thing.
People will be elected to Congress and the Senate who will have this as their priority, because people will be asking, what are you doing to protect our civil liberties?
If you keep it narrow, and I think there are political organizers all across the aisle, all across the spectrum, who understand that point.
Some people in the Tea Party movement are, typical gung-ho red team pro-war types, but others are not. You have these so-called liberty movement Republicans, folks like Representative Justin Amash, Senator Rand Paul, who are more libertarian-leaning Republicans in the House and Senate. You have these sort of ACLU-ish Democrats like Ron Wyden in the Senate, Jared Polis in the House of Representatives.
The movement has had thus far, particularly at the local and state level, is that a product and part of the fact that there's cooperation from across traditional political spectrums? No question about it.
You crossed party lines to join Senator Rand Paul in that filibuster, slowing up John Brennan's nomination because you were concerned about drones. I know you think you made your point. You must have gotten a lot of blowback from your fellow Democrats in joining with conservative Rand Paul.
Not too much, Howard, because I think there is a sense that there is a new political movement emerging in our country, and it crosses party lines, and it is all about Americans who want to see policymakers strike a better balance between protecting our security and protecting our liberty.
There is new fallout from the NSA phone surveillance program, and it's creating a rather unusual alliance in the court. The NRA is joining forces with the American Civil Liberties Union. The NRA with the ACLU in a lawsuit to end the program.
There were a number of people who looked at that and thought, my goodness, if those two agree, then there must actually be something here.
In terms of what actual occupiers and Tea Partiers at the grassroots are doing, they're both doing this decentralized form of organizing that might possibly put people in a frame of mind for decentralized politics, you know, and alternatives to the sort of centralized politics that gives us the Patriot Act and these encroachments on the Bill of Rights, that gives us an imperial foreign policy. You've got to have this granular approach, issue by issue, if you're going to break out of this left wing versus right wing frame of looking at the world. There's so much more than just two colors to the United States.
You have to believe that the U.S.'s ability to claim to stand for the rule of law and for human rights and for democracy is dramatically undermined when they completely violate those same principles. The best way to answer the question, like, why are civil liberties important, is to kind of think in a very material way about the difference between what it is to live in a country where they are respected for the most part and one where they're not. You know, and that difference, it pervades every aspect of your life. Just every person, every government actor, every state actor, and then just people on the street. Do they see you as fundamentally equal to them, or a person who has dignity, is deserving of dignity and respect? Or instead, are you treated as, you know, somebody who's expendable and who fundamentally doesn't deserve to be here and doesn't have to be treated in a fair way? Certain segments of society have largely enjoyed the benefits of freedom. You know, there's always been exceptions to that rule. Sometimes there were very, very large exceptions. And the idea that those would kind of go away on a widespread basis, which is certainly a possibility living in the era that we are living in now, you know, should be deeply troubling to anybody who has spent any time in a country or where it wasn't that way.
I'm interested in living in a democracy. I'm interested in what that is as the experiment, which we get further away from. Our money in politics, too much power in the presidential office. I mean, it's all just getting skewed away from the possibility of democracy. But to have democracy is to be able to respect another's point of view. But it doesn't mean you have to buy into it or conform it to a force. Because if a member of Congress is hearing from a Tea Partier from their point of view of why this is wrong, and from a progressive Democrat on why it's wrong for them, and on a radical progressive on why it's wrong for them, and on a businessman on why it's wrong for them, those layers start to have an effect. And I think we all need to work better to do that, and not think we have to all do this together. But that what is it that we really believe in? Because that's really what democracy is. Instead of what we see now is our government and what the end result of our politicians are. But where is the place where democracy really aligns, where the Socratean dialogue happens, which is the place where we can all share our values, and then from that place of sharing, come to some greater wisdom.
Civil liberties, the rights that are enshrined in our Bill of Rights, are the most basic political rights, the ones that are essential to a free society, to a functioning democracy, the idea that the best ideas will prevail.
The first affirms freedom of religion, speech and press, and the right of assembly and petition.